After studying this module, you shall be able to know the anatomy and functioning properties of human brain, know about compartmentalization and hemispheric lateralization of the brain, know mind and body conceptions, know about the new upcoming field of cognitive neuroscience, know about the functioning of the nervous system. It's imperative that a student of psychology acquaints himself or herself with a thorough study and knowledge of the anatomy of human brain and its functioning. Human brain is the most complex machine ever produced with fascinating working tendencies. It's very flexible. One part takes over if another fails, and limiting as such in certain circumstances. Nevertheless, it's very intriguing an experience to travel the brain journey. In this module, we shall go further. We will touch upon mind and body issues. We will take a look at what our ancestors thought was the brain-body connection and what today we recognize as their relationship. Towards the end of this module, we will discuss briefly about the new emerging field of cognitive neuroscience, what it is and what other fields it draws from. Let us first get an introduction to the brain. In an evolutionary sense, your brain is far older than you are, for it represents perhaps 500 million years of evolutionary development and fine-tuning. The human brain is like a living archaeological site, with the more recently developed structures built upon structures from the distant evolutionary past. The structures at the brain's core, which we share with other vertebrates, govern the basic physiological functions that keep us alive, such as breathing and heart rate. Built upon these basic structures are the newer systems that evolve progressively more complex functions such as sensing, emoting, wanting, thinking and reasoning. Evolutionary theorists believe that as generic variations sculpted these newer structures over time, natural selection favored their retention because animals who had them were more likely to survive in changing environments. The brain has traditionally been viewed as having three major subdivisions: the hindbrain, the midbrain, the forebrain. We will discuss first the cerebral cortex of the forebrain in detail. Benchmarking evolutionary achievement in brain was the cerebral cortex. It can be conceptualized as a solid sheet of 1/4 of an inch thickness constituting of grey cells which are unmyelinated that compose the external coating of the human brain. Fish and amphibians have no cerebral cortex, and the progression from more primitive to more advanced mammals is marked by a dramatic increase in the proportion of cortical tissue. In humans, however, nearly 3/4 of the brain structure is constituted by cortex. The vitality of cerebral cortex lies more in the daily human functioning in comparison to brain stem structures which prove imperative for physical existence. Because the cortex is wrinkled and convoluted like a wrapped up piece of paper, a great amount of cortical tissue occupies relatively less room in the brain structure. If we would remove the cortex and smooth it out, the tissue would cover an area roughly the size of a pillowcase. Perhaps 75% of the cortex total surface area lies within its fissures or canyons like folds. Three of these fissures are important landmarks. The right and left hemispheres of the brain are marked by one large fissure that extends vertically over the top of the brain. A central fissure dissects each hemisphere into front and rear halves, and a third fissure horizontally over the brain. On the basis of these landmarks, neurologists have divided each hemisphere into 4 lobes, that is frontal, parietal, occipital and temporal. All cerebral lobes are associated with particular functions related to sensory inputs and motor movements, as well as with speech, understanding and speech production. The large areas that do not link with sensory or motor functions constitute the associated cortex, implicated in various cognitive functions such as attention, learning, memory, perception, etc. More than 600 muscles constituting our voluntary body movements are governed by motor cortex. If all of these muscles are activated at once, they would generate enough power to lift 11 tons. The motor cortex occupies place ahead of the frontal lobe next to the central fissure. Because the nerve tract from the motor cortex cross over at the level of medulla, therefore both hemispheres control the opposite movements of the body. Thus, severe body lesions in the right motor cortex would produce paralysis in the left side of the body. Sensory receptors transmit information to basic areas of cortex. With the exception of taste and smell, and at least single unique area in the cortex is discerned by each of the 5 senses. The somatic sensory cortex receives inputs that give rise to our sensations of heat, touch and cold, and to our senses of balance and body movements. It lies at the front portion of the parietal lobe just behind the motor cortex, separated from it by the central fissures. The somatic sensory area is basically organized in an upside down fashion, with the feet being represented near the top of the brain. Likewise, the amount of cortex devoted to each body area is directly proportional to that region's sensory sensitivity. In each of the sensorium, specific sensory inputs is responded by various neurons, which is associated with particular attributes of the environment. Thus, certain cells in the visual cortex fire only when sensations happen from particular stimulus such as the vertical line or a corner. Nevertheless, the sensory cortex, like other parts of the brain, is also sensitive to experience. For example, when people learn to read Braille, the area in the sensory cortex that receives inputs from the fingertips increase in size, making the person more sensitive to the tiny sets of raised dots. 2 separate areas that control the construction and comprehension of speech are also placed in separate lobes of the left hemisphere. Speech comprehension is foremost governed by Wernicke's area placed in the temporal lobe. Lesions to this cortical region leads to inability in understanding written or spoken speech. Broca's area, situated in the frontal lobe, is primarily implicated in the generation of speech in association with the motor cortex region that governs the muscles used in speech. Lesions to Broca's area leads to inability in expression of speech, keeping the comprehension of speech intact. These 2 speech areas normally work in concert when you are conversing with another person, when you allow to comprehend what the other person is saying and to express your own thoughts. The association cortex is implicated in various vital cognitive processes such as attention, perception, memory, etc. The cortex is many times connoted as silent areas, since electrical stimulation of the area does not lead to any sensory or motor activity. Lesions to this imperative structure leads to aberrations in the area of language, thought, decision making and problem solving. As we might expect, quantification of association cortex is far higher in human beings as compared to lower animals. It occupies 3/4 room of the cerebral cortex in human species and assumes responsibility for people's superior cognitive abilities. Let us now come to parallel processing. Parallel processing is the ability to carry out multiple operations or tasks simultaneously. The term is used in the context of both human cognition and computing of machines. In the human context, it refers to the ability of the brain to simultaneously process incoming stimuli in more than one ways. It is also called parallel distributed processing model. Let's learn about parallel processing through neural networks. Neural network model are computer models whose programming involves replication of assumptions governing the nervous system. Every neural network consists of interrelated nodes. Each node does not carry specific measures of information. Hence, there is no unique node for red or a unique node for fire engine and so on. Rather, each node in itself is like a complete information processing unit. To explain it with an analogy, imagine each individual neuron in the brain as a separate node transferring information from one neuron to the another, but no unique node for any specific aspect is known. There is no specific neuron that connotes for red color or for a fire engine. Recall that in the brain, neurons have synaptic connections with many other neurons receive and send signal that can be excitatory, increasing the likelihood that a neuron will fire, or inhibitory, decrease the likelihood that a neuron will fire, and will fire if the overall input they receive moves from electrical potential to a certain threshold point. Similarly, nodes in the neural network have connections in many other nodes, are programmed to receive and transmit auxiliary or inhibitory signals and get aroused after stimulus strength moves beyond a particular threshold level. Just as learning experiences modify the brain neural circuitry, in computer stimulations, neural networks gain proficiency through a variety of information bits such as sounds or visual patterns. As we do, connections among various nodes increase or decrease. They are reflected by changes in the mathematical weight assigned to each connection, and the network acknowledges the differentiates between different kinds of stimuli like images of faces, spoken words and so on. In trying to model how memory operates, if concepts such as red and fire engine are not stored in their own individual nodes, then where are they preserved? In the neural network models, each memory corresponds to unique prototype of interconnected and simultaneously aroused nodes. As we glance at the entire neural framework, various nodes distributed in neural fabric fiber in parallel to each other and simultaneously spread their activation to their nodes. In this manner, priming of one node is done by another and information is received as a consequence. Let's now move on to the compartmentalization of brain. Refers to the tendency of the human brain to store two conflicting set of ideas in two different parts of the brain. It's a divide and conquer process that separate thoughts that conflict each other. This often happens when there are different beliefs and values in an individual. In a nutshell, the individual is confused. For example, a person who is very religious and also a scientist holds the opposing beliefs in different cognitive compartments, such as when she is in a church, she carries with herself blind faith towards God, and on the other hand, when she works in her laboratory, she questions everything. To some extent, we all compartmentalize our lives. Are we not entirely different in front of guests, and when we are back to our original personality? We rationalize this by justifying that's how it is. To describe the compartmentalization in a more scientific manner, we can define it as an unconscious psychological defense mechanism used to avoid cognitive dissonance or the mental discomfort or anxiety caused by the person's conflicting values, cognitions, emotions, beliefs, etc. within themselves. Compartmentalization may lead to hidden vulnerabilities in those who use it as a major defense mechanism. They may become highly confused in discussions and decision making, become indifferent to lose self-confidence, or use denial altogether against the conflict. To help someone become more integrated as an individual, one therapeutic technique is to take two chairs and have the person sit alternately between the two seats as he or she has a conversation with himself or herself, seeking to understand the other personality. With time, the walls will crumble and the person will develop a balanced understanding. Let's move on to the hemispheres. Our brain anatomy can be divided into two halves, left brain, left hemisphere, and the right brain or the right hemisphere. Both of them perform different functions in human body. They together create human perception. At any given time, a human being uses both the hemispheres of his or her functioning. However, at any given moment, one tends to dominate the other. This tendency of hemispheres to dominate over each other has given rise to a theory called personality type. The various compartments or experiments conducted have shown that the left brain aids logic, reasoning and is responsible for happy emotions, while the right brain aids creativity, imagination and sad emotions. This does not mean one is better than the other. It only emphasizes the nature plan of segregating these two emotions in the human brain, giving one part one job. A PET scan can easily reveal which side of the brain a human uses more often. Dominating hemisphere accordingly is categorized as logical or creative. Now let us have an understanding of mind and body issues. Humans have long sought to understand themselves, and for ages the mind-body problem has occurred at the center of this quest. Is the mind independent of the body, an internal catalyst of consciousness and cognition, or it is merged with the body and is deeply influenced by body activities? Many earlier philosophers held the position of mind-body dualism, that mind and body are separate entities and independent of laws that govern each of the entities. But if the mind is not composed of physical matter, how could it become aware of bodily sensations? And how could its thoughts exert control over bodily functions? French philosopher and scientist Descartes posited interaction of mind and body through brain's petit pineal gland. Although Descartes placed the mind within the brain, he posited mind to be a spiritual and non-material entity. Dualism implied lack of evidences to ascertain established boundaries between mind and body. Another view, monism, proposes unification of mind and body and rejects independent existence of either. To monists, mental events correspond to physical events in the brain, a position held by English philosopher Hobbes. Monism helped set the stage for psychology because it implied that the mind could be studied by measuring physical processes within the brain. Information philosophy today views mind as the immaterial information in the brain, a biological processor of information. Mind is seen as a software in the brain's hardware. The mind has an extensive control over the body and vice versa. Body is seen as a physical entity run and managed by the brain. Let us now move on to cognitive neuroscience. Cognitive neuroscience concerns the scientific study of neural mechanisms that underlie cognition. It is a branch of neuroscience and overlaps with cognitive psychology. Researchers within the discipline look at psychological, computational and biological mechanisms that impact human thought and cognition. Cognitive neuroscience uses a good deal of technical know-how in its working. Advanced brain imaging systems to gain in-depth information and knowledge of the working of the brain. The study of genetics also play an important role in the discipline as scientists attempt to track down any genetic roots to behavior. Cognitive neuroscience is an interdisciplinary area emerging from many fields. Some of these are prominent ones and some are not. Although historically speaking, the discipline has progressed from which area of brain do what, today it has come to how the brain creates the mind. Cognitive neuroscience is a very new field of science. Let us now move on to the nervous system. The managerial hub of the body is the nervous system. The entire functioning of the system is carried out by three variants of neurons. Sensory neurons transfer input stimulus from the sensoriums to the spinal cord and the brain. On the other hand, motor neurons transfer messages from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles and body organs. Finally, there are neurons that link the input and output information. These interneurons, which are far more than sensory and motor neurons, execute associative functions within the human nervous system. For example, interneurons would help in recognition of a friend by associating the sensory input from the visual area with the memory of that person's characteristics preserved in different regions of the brain. The activity of interneurons make it possible the complexity of our cognitive, metacognitive, emotional and behavioral capacities. The nervous system can be broken down into several interrelated subsystems. The two major subsystems or divisions are the peripheral and central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system contains all the neural structures that lie outside the brain and spinal cord. Its specialized neurons assist in executing the input function that enables us to recognize the external and internal activities within the body, and secondly the output capacities or functions that capacitate us to function with our muscles. The peripheral nervous system has two major divisions, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system comprises of sensory neurons that are dedicated to transfer inputs from sense organs and motor neurons that transmit information from the brain to the spinal cord to the muscles that govern intended actions. The axons of sensory neurons bunch together like strands of a rope to compose sensory nerves, and motor neurons, axons, unite to structure motor nerves. As you read, sensory neurons in your eye are sending impulses to a complex network of specialized visual tracts that course through your brain. Inside the brain and spinal cord, nerves are called tracts. At the same time, motor neurons are stimulating the eye movement that allow you to scan the lines and turn the pages. The somatic system thus allows you to sense and respond to your environment. The covert environment of the body is primarily regulated by the functioning of the autonomic nervous system, which governs the implicit functions of the body, controls the glands and soft muscles that constitute the heart, the blood vessels and the lining of the stomach and the intestine. The autonomic system primarily deals with involuntary functions such as respiration, circulation and digestion. It also plays a role in motivation, emotional response and stress coping strategies. It consists of two subdivisions, the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Typically, the two divisions affect the same organs or glands in opposing ways. The sympathetic nervous system bears an activation process and it tends to present as a holistic unit. For example, when you face a stressful situation, your sympathetic nervous system lets you meet the stressor in several ways. It speeds up your heart rate so that it can pump extra blood to your muscles, dilate your pupils so that additional light can go into your eyes and improve your vision. It slows down your digestive system so that blood can be transferred to the muscles, increase your rate of respiration so that your body can get more oxygen, and in general mobilizes your body. This is sometimes called the fight or flight response. Compared to the sympathetic branch, which presents itself as unified element, the parasympathetic nervous system is way strong in its executions, impacting multiple organs at a time. In general, it calms the functioning of the body and eventually maintains equilibrium. Thus, your sympathetic system races up your heart and your parasympathetic system calms it down. By working together to maintain an equilibrium in your internal organs, the two divisions can maintain homeostasis, a delicately balanced or constant internal state. In addition, sympathetic and parasympathetic activities sometimes coordinate to enable us to perform certain behaviors. For example, sexual function in the male involves penile erection through parasympathetic dilation of blood vessels, followed by ejaculation, which is a primarily sympathetic function. Now let's move on to central nervous system. More than any other system in our body, the central nervous system contains the brain and the spinal cord, which connects most part of the peripheral nervous system with the brain. Most nerves center and leave the central nervous system by the way of the spinal cord. a structure that is 16 to 18 inches long and about 1 inch in diameter in a human adult. The vertebrae or bones of the spine protect the spinal cord neurons. When the spinal cord is viewed in cross section, its central portion resembles an H or a butterfly. The H-shaped portion consists largely of grey colored neuron cell bodies and their interrelated connections. At the periphery of the grey matter is white colored myelated axons that connect intricate hierarchy of the spinal cord with each other and with the higher areas of the brain. Entering the backside of the spinal cord all through its length are sensory nerves. Motor nerves exit the spinal cord's front side. Some simple stimulus response sequences known as spinal reflexes can be triggered at the level of the spinal cord without any involvement of the brain. For example, if you touch something hot, sensory receptors in your skin trigger nerve impulses in motor nerves that flash into your spinal cord and synapse inside the interneurons. The interneurons then excite motor neurons that send impulses to your hand so that you pull away. Other interneurons simultaneously carry the hot message up the spinal cord to your brain. But it's life-saving that you don't have to wait for the brain to tell you what to do in such emergencies. Getting message to and from the brain takes slightly longer, so the spinal cord reflex system significantly reduces reaction time and in this case potential tissue damage. Lastly, let's also talk about the brain. The 3 pounds of protein, fat and fluid that you carry around inside your skull, which you call the real you. It's also the most complex structure in the known universe. Neuroscientists estimate that this 3-pound powerhouse contains about 3 million miles of neural connections. If these lines form a neural trail, it would take you 5.7 years to drive an auto at 60 meters per hour, 24 hours a day from one end to the other. As befits this biological marvel, brain emerges to be most vigorous energy consumer of all our body organs. Although your brain relates for just 2% of your total body weight, it utilizes about 25% of your body's oxygen and 70% of its glucose. Moreover, the brain never rests as its rate of energy metabolism is relatively constant day and night. In fact, when you dream, the brain's metabolic rate actually increases slightly. The brain commands to the body to behave the way it behaves. This brings us to the end of this module. Let us quickly summarize what we have already read about. The cerebral cortex is the crown of the head present in advanced level species. Parallel processing is the ability of the human brain to process effectively multiple sets of information. Compartmentalization of the brain is the technique of separately storing and processing 2 or more conflicting ideas in the brain. Our brain is divided into right and left hemisphere, each performing different functions of our cognition and existence. Mind is an intangible personal entity while body is tangible physical entity. Both have an extensive impact over each other. Cognitive neuroscience is a science in its nascent stage which studies neural activity under cognition.